Dr. Vieth Serrano had cataloged 612 species across her career, and not one of them had made her equipment scream like this. The blood sample sat under the analyzer like a small vial of war crimes, throwing flags so fast the holographic display looked like a slot machine having a panic attack. 174 contamination warnings in under 9 seconds, and Vieth just stood there, her silicon-plated fingers frozen over the console, watching the numbers climb with the quiet horror of someone who had just opened a door they could not close. She ran the panel again. Same flags. A third time. Identical. The human sitting on the examination table across the room had not moved. Commander Riva Okafor, first diplomatic attaché of the species called humanity, sat with her legs crossed and her hands folded in her lap, like a woman waiting for a bus that was running 3 minutes late. She did not look like a biohazard. She looked like someone who might ask if the cafeteria had decent coffee. "Is everything okay over there?" Riva asked, and her voice carried the particular calm of a person who had been poked, prodded, and scanned for 4 straight hours, and had made peace with it somewhere around hour 2. Vieth could not answer. Not yet. She was reading the contamination list, and her stomachs, both of them, were doing something unpleasant. Capsaicin, a compound classified under Union Biohazard Code 7714. Lethal to 39 indexed species at concentrations above 0.002%. Present in the human's bloodstream at measurable levels. Ethanol, a solvent used in Union industrial degreasing, restricted under 4 separate treaties. Metabolic traces confirmed. Caffeine, a psychoactive alkaloid that shut down the nervous systems of Telvanni, Drovhari, and Keth organisms at any detectable concentration. The human's blood was swimming in it. Theobromine, acetic acid, allyl, isothiocyanate. 63 compounds total. Every single one classified as a Class 4 biocide under Galactic Union law. Every single one present in the blood of the woman who was now checking her fingernails with the energy of someone mildly bored. Vieth's hand found the emergency contamination button before her brain finished forming the thought. The quarantine alarm sounded like a dying animal, a long, wet howl that flooded the medical wing and sealed every door within a 40-meter radius. Riva looked up, not with fear, but with the mild confusion of a tourist who had accidentally set off a museum alarm by standing too close to a painting. "That's not about me, right?" Riva said. It was absolutely about her. Within the hour, the situation had escalated past anything Vieth's training had prepared her for. Commander Okafor was sealed in a negative pressure isolation chamber, which she accepted with a shrug and a request for something to read. Preferably fiction. The Union's Toxicology Board convened an emergency session, pulling representatives from 19 species out of whatever they had been doing at 3 in the morning station time. And Vieth stood at the center of a holographic briefing room, presenting findings that made her colleagues look at her like she had lost her mind. The human contained 63 Class 4 biocides, she said, and the room did not breathe. Ambassador Kethari, a being older than most planets Vieth had visited, leaned forward with the careful slowness of someone who wanted to make sure they had heard correctly. "In what concentration?" "Baseline," Vieth said. "These are not contamination traces. These are resting biological levels. The human's body produces, processes, and tolerates these compounds as a normal function of its metabolism." The room erupted, not with shouting. Telvanni did not shout, but with a particular high-frequency hum that meant 31 species were all experiencing dread at the same time, and the translators could not keep up. The Drovhari delegate's biometric implant triggered a health alert just from the stress of hearing the chemical list read aloud. 2 Keth observers requested immediate atmospheric purification of the briefing room, despite the fact that the human was 3 decks away behind 6 inches of reinforced quarantine glass. And the consensus, when it came, landed on Vyeth like a rock from orbit. "The species has been engineered," Ambassador Kethari said, and the room hummed agreement. No natural evolutionary pathway produces this degree of chemical resistance. Someone built them. Someone designed a biological weapon and gave it legs and a diplomatic smile. Vyeth wanted to argue, wanted to say that the human she had spent 4 hours examining did not feel like a weapon. Commander Okafor had laughed at Vyeth's confusion over human bilateral symmetry, had asked genuinely kind questions about Telvanni photosynthesis, had made a joke about getting a little extra sun that Vyeth did not understand, but suspected was warm. But the data was the data. She was ordered to investigate, full access to humanity's cultural and biological databases, a research team of 9, and a mandate that came directly from the Union Security Council. Find the weapons program, find whoever engineered these creatures, and determine the threat level before humanity's diplomatic delegation got any closer to Union leadership. Vyeth accepted the assignment. She was a scientist. She followed evidence. That night, alone in her lab, she opened humanity's cultural archive for the first time. The database was enormous, chaotic, organized with the frantic energy of a species that had been storing information for 10,000 years and never once agreed on a filing system. She started where any good xenobiologist would start, with consumption data. Because what a species ate told you more about its biology than 1,000 blood panels ever could. She expected to find supplements, chemical regimens, maybe a history of forced ingestion protocols, military conditioning programs, something that explained how 63 lethal compounds ended up in a single organism's bloodstream. What she found was a recipe for something called Nashville hot chicken. She read the ingredient list once. She read it again. Capsaicin, deliberately added, in quantities that would qualify as an assassination attempt under Union law. Butter, a saturated lipid extracted from bovine mammary secretions. Cayenne pepper, habanero pepper, ghost pepper. The recipe had a 5-star rating, 4,217 user reviews. One review said, "Made my eyes water and my nose run, but I ate the whole thing and then made another batch." Vyeth closed the file. She opened another. Sichuan mapo tofu, more capsaicin. Something called Sichuan peppercorn that triggered nerve paralysis in 14 Union species. And a user review that said, "Not spicy enough, doubled the chili oil next time." She opened another. Fermented kimchi, deliberately rotted vegetables preserved in salt and more capsaicin. Another single malt Scotch whiskey, ethanol, pure ethanol, aged in wooden barrels for 12 years as if time made poison more sophisticated. Another, espresso, concentrated caffeine extract, consumed multiple times daily, sometimes before the sun had even risen. Vyeth sat back in her chair. The chemical weapons program she had been sent to find did not exist. What existed instead was something far stranger, far more unsettling, far more difficult to explain to a room full of species who considered capsaicin a war crime. It was a cookbook. Thousands of them. Millions. Humanity had not been engineered to resist poison. Been eating poison on purpose, for fun, for thousands of years. And they had written down the recipes and given them star ratings and argued in the comments about whether the poison was poisonous enough. Vyeth stared at the screen and felt something she had never felt in 612 species of study. She had no idea what she was dealing with. Commander Riva Okafor had survived 2 civil conflicts, a shuttle crash in the Saharan desert, and a custody hearing that lasted 11 months. But nothing in her 38 years of living had prepared her for the experience of explaining breakfast to an auditorium full of aliens who were looking at her like she had just confessed to murder. The room held 31 delegations. Some stood, some floated in atmospheric pods. One species appeared to be a sentient cloud of yellow gas hovering politely near the ceiling, and every single one of them had their translation devices cranked to maximum, recording every word she said with the intensity of intelligence analysts decoding a threat briefing. They had called it a cultural exchange seminar. It was a trial, and the crime was lunch. "Walk us through a standard human meal cycle," the moderator said, a Keth elder, whose name Riva could not pronounce without dislocating something in her jaw. Carried the diplomatic sweetness of someone who had already decided the defendant was guilty and was simply collecting evidence. Riva pulled up the holographic display, took a breath that she would later describe as the last calm breath of my diplomatic career, and started with breakfast. "Most humans begin their day with coffee," she said. Silence. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for more. The loaded silence of a room full of creatures who had just heard a word their translators flagged as a chemical weapon. "Coffee," Riva continued, "because stopping now would only make it worse, is a beverage brewed from the roasted seeds of a plant called coffea. The active compound is caffeine, which is a psychoactive alkaloid." The Telvanni delegate stood up and left. He did not excuse himself. He did not signal the moderator. He simply rose from his seat with the rigid posture of someone whose body had decided to leave, regardless of what. His brain thought about it, and he walked out through the side door. Riva watched him go, then turned back to the room. "Caffeine is produced by the coffee plant as a natural insecticide," she said. "It evolved specifically to kill small organisms that tried to eat it." A Drovhari diplomat in the third row made a sound that Riva's translator rendered as absolute biological revulsion. His biometric implant began flashing amber. "Humans consume this compound every morning," Riva said. "Multiple cups. Some humans become irritable and non-functional without it. We have a saying, 'Do not talk to me before my coffee.' It is only partially a joke." The moderator's tendrils had gone very still. "You are telling this assembly that your species begins each day by voluntarily ingesting a neurotoxic insecticide." "With cream and sugar, usually," Riva said. She moved to lunch. This was where things got complicated. She described a Thai green curry. She started with the coconut milk, which was fine. Alien delegations nodded along. Coconut milk was benign, fatty, plant-derived, unthreatening. Then she got to the chilies. "Capsaicin," she said, and pulled up the molecular structure on the holographic display, like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "This is the compound that gives chili peppers their heat. It activates pain receptors in mammalian tissue. The burning sensation you feel when eating a chili pepper is not flavor. It is your nervous system telling you that you are being hurt." The room leaned back, collectively, like a single organism recoiling. "Humans," Reva continued, "responded to this by breeding peppers to produce more capsaicin, significantly more. We hold competitions to eat the hottest peppers on Earth. The winners often cry, vomit, and temporarily lose the ability to speak. They also receive trophies." The Keth delegate raised a manipulator arm. "Commander Okafor, is this a form of ritualized self-harm?" Reva considered this for a moment longer than she should have. "We call it Taco Tuesday," she said. The translator struggled with that one. She never reached dinner. She never even got close, because between lunch and dinner she tried to explain cheese, and the room simply could not handle it. "Cheese," she began, and she could feel the word already carrying more weight than it deserved, "is produced by taking milk, the mammary secretion of a bovine animal, and deliberately introducing bacteria to curdle it." "You are describing spoilage," the moderator said. "Yes," Reva said, "intentional spoilage, yes, of another creature's mammary fluid, correct? And then you consume this." "We age it first," Reva said, "sometimes for years. Some varieties develop mold on the surface. We eat that too. One French variety, Roquefort, is specifically defined by the presence of Penicillium roqueforti, a living fungal colony growing through the product. It is considered a delicacy. It costs quite a lot of money." The delegate from the Vel Consortium stood and formally requested that the seminar be classified as a biological threat briefing and moved to a secure facility. The motion failed, but only by 2 votes. A being near the back of the room, species unknown, roughly the shape and color of an anxious eggplant, asked through its translator if humanity had ever considered simply eating things that did not fight back. Reva thought about her grandmother. That thought arrived without permission, the way the important ones always did. Not the scientific grandmother, not the historical grandmother, but the real one. Abuela Beatriz in Salvador, with her hands that smelled like palm oil and Scotch bonnet, standing over a pot of pepper soup so hot the kitchen windows fogged from the inside. "You could eat things that do not fight back," Reva said, and her voice shifted in a way that made Vyeth, watching from the observation gallery, lean forward. "You could eat bland, safe, neutral things that sit on your tongue and do nothing. And humans have done that. In hospitals, in prisons, in the worst moments of our history when choice was taken from us." She paused. "But when we are free, when we have a choice, we reach for the thing that burns. Not because we enjoy pain, but because the burn means something. My grandmother made a pepper soup that could strip paint off a wall. She made it when someone was sick. She made it when someone was grieving. She made it when someone was afraid. And the heat of it, that searing, eye-watering, nose-running heat, it was not punishment. It was her way of saying, you are alive, and I am here, and this will not kill you, even though it feels like it might. The room was very quiet. That is why we eat what we eat, Reva said, not because we are weapons, because we were engineered, but because somewhere in our history, someone decided that the things that hurt could also be the things that heal. And we have been cooking with that idea ever since. The seminar was adjourned. 2 days later, Vyeth's toxicology report was leaked to the Union Infonet. It spread through 17 star systems in under 6 hours. The report was dry, clinical, factual, and it terrified every species that read it. Not because of what it said about human biology, but because of the photograph someone had attached to the file. A photograph pulled from humanity's cultural archive, showing a small human child, no more than 4 years old, biting into a bright red chili pepper with an expression of pure, unhinged delight. Tears already streaming down her face, reaching for a second one with her other hand. 17 species formally petitioned to reclassify humanity as an apex predator. Humanity had not fired a single shot. They had not raised a single weapon. They had just eaten lunch. And the galaxy had watched and trembled. 6 months after the cultural exchange seminar, that 17 species had formally requested be reclassified as a psychological horror event. Dr. Vyeth Serrano stood in the command center of Caliph Station and watched every alarm she had ever been trained to fear go off at the same time. The station shook, not the gentle vibration of engine calibration or the rhythmic hum of atmospheric cycling. This was the shudder of something breaking that was never supposed to break. A sound that traveled through the floor and up through Vyeth's silicon bones and settled in the space between her 2 stomachs like a stone. Cargo Bay 7 had ruptured. The details came in pieces, each one worse than the last. A containment unit carrying resin compound, an industrial solvent used in hull manufacturing, had cracked during a routine transfer. The aerosolized chemical was now flooding decks 14 and 15 through the ventilation system. Blast doors had sealed automatically, which meant the contamination was contained. It also meant that 46 people were trapped inside it. Vyeth knew resin compound the way every Union scientist knew it. Not as a theoretical danger, but as the specific nightmare they had been taught to respect above all others. At 0.3 parts per million, it dissolved soft tissue. At 1.0 parts per million, it broke down cellular walls. At concentrations above 2.0 parts per million, organic matter simply stopped being organic matter and became something closer to soup. The sensors on Deck 14 read 4.7 parts per million. And climbing. The station commander, a Vel Consortium officer named Dranathi, stood at the tactical display with the posture of someone who had already done the math and did not like the answer. Every hazmat team on the station was rated for 0.5 parts per million maximum. Sending them in was not a rescue operation. It was adding to the body count. "How long do they have?" Dranathi asked. Voice was the kind of calm that only existed on the other side of panic. "At current concentration, unprotected Telvanni tissue fails in 4 minutes, the environmental officer said. Dravhari and 6. Keth exoskeletons may hold for 9, but respiratory exposure will. "How long?" Dranathi repeated. "Minutes. Not many." The command center had the particular silence of people watching something terrible happen and knowing they could not stop it. Vyeth could see the biosignals of the trapped civilians on the display. 46 lights, each one a life, each one dimming in a way that meant their bodies were already beginning to respond to the chemical invasion. That was when the door to the command center opened and Commander Riva Okafor walked in. She was not supposed to be here. She was on Calef Station for a trade summit, staying in the diplomatic wing 3 sections away, and the station-wide alarm should have sent her to an evacuation point, like everyone else. Instead, she was here, still wearing the dark formal jacket of a diplomatic function. And behind her stood 3 human engineers who had apparently also decided that evacuation was optional. "What is the compound?" Riva asked. Dranathi looked at her with the expression of someone who had forgotten that humans were on his station. "Rethin, aerosolized, Deck 14 and 15. The concentration is—" "What is it made of?" Riva asked, cutting him off with the efficiency of someone who did not have time for the full chemical biography. The environmental officer pulled up the molecular structure. Riva studied it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned to her lead engineer, a tall woman named Chen Wei, whose arms were covered in old chemical burn scars that she had never bothered to have removed. "Sodium hypochlorite base," Chen Wei said, squinting at the display. "Chloramine gas adjacent. Acidic aerosol delivery." In human terms, Chen Wei tilted her head. "You ever mix bleach and ammonia by accident?" "Once," Riva said. "College apartment. Bathroom was disgusting. Opened the window and finished scrubbing. Stronger than that, but same family." Riva turned back to Dranathi. "We will go in." The silence that followed was not shock. It was incomprehension. The kind of silence that happens when a sentence is grammatically correct, but semantically impossible. "Commander," Dranathi said, "the concentration is 4.7 parts per million. Unprotected exposure at that level." "Will sting," Riva said. "We will need breathing masks, standard issue, not hazmat, and eye protection. Goggles, not face shields. We need to see clearly. Standard breathing masks are rated for." "We are not asking for a safety certification," Riva said. "We are asking for masks. Do you have them or not?" Dranathi had them. 4 minutes later, Riva and her 3 engineers stood at the blast door to Deck 14. They wore standard-issue respirators, work goggles, and their regular uniforms. No hazmat suits, no chemical protection, no sealed environments. Vyeth watched from the command center. Her bio readouts linked to all 4 humans. Their heart rates were elevated but controlled. Chen Wei's blood pressure was high. One of the other engineers, a man named Kowalski, had cracked his knuckles 11 times in the past 60 seconds. The blast door opened. The air inside was visible, a yellowish haze that moved like something alive, curling and folding in on itself, filling the corridor with a color that Vyeth's species associated with death, because it was, in every biological sense that mattered, death made into weather. Riva walked in first. Her biosignals spiked, eyes watering immediately, throat constricting. The skin on her exposed hands began to redden within seconds. Chen Wei coughed hard enough that Vyeth heard it through the audio feed, a wet and ugly sound that carried the specific texture of lungs, encountering something they did not appreciate. "Smells like a pool supply store threw up in a microwave," Kowalski said through his mask, and then he walked in too. They moved fast, not running, because running meant heavy breathing, and heavy breathing meant pulling more of the compound into their lungs, but with the efficient urgency of people who understood that time was not a suggestion. The first group of survivors was on Deck 14, Section C. 11 Telvanni researchers huddled in a sealed laboratory, their photosynthetic membranes already showing chemical burns, their breathing shallow and ragged. Riva and Chen Wei carried them two at a time, arms wrapped around silicon-boned bodies that weighed almost nothing, moving through the yellow haze like it was a mild inconvenience rather than a death sentence. Second trip, Deck 15. 20 Drovari technicians and 6 Keth maintenance workers, barricaded in a storage room that had the faintest atmospheric seal but was losing pressure. Kowalski kicked the door open, which should not have been possible given the magnetic lock, but apparently human legs operated on a different understanding of what doors were allowed to do. Third trip, the last 9, scattered across 2 corridors, some unconscious, some barely breathing. Riva carried a Vel child who had stopped moving, tucked against her chest like something precious, and walked through a corridor where the concentration had reached 6.1 parts per million. Her eyes were swollen almost shut by then. She did not slow down. 46 survivors, 3 trips, 18 minutes total. When the blast door sealed behind them for the final time, Riva pulled off her mask and vomited into a waste bin, with the matter-of-fact attitude of someone who considered this an acceptable cost of doing business. Chen Wei sat on the floor and bled from her nose. For 3 minutes straight, without commenting on it, Kowalski's hands were raw and blistered, and he kept flexing them like he was testing whether they still worked. They were all alive. They were all going to stay alive. Vyeth watched the medical teams swarm the survivors and then turned to the humans with the panicked confusion of doctors encountering patients who should be dead, but were instead complaining about a headache. Riva had chemical burns across both forearms. Chen Wei would cough blood for a week and speak in a rasp for a month. Kowalski lost feeling in 3 fingers for 6 days. All 4 humans were released from medical within 72 hours. The 46 Union citizens they carried out of a gas that would have dissolved Vyeth's lungs in under 4 minutes were alive, because 4 humans had treated a lethal chemical environment the way they apparently treated everything else, as something that was deeply unpleasant, but ultimately survivable if you just kept moving. The Union did not reclassify humanity as apex predators. The existing classification felt too small, too biological, too much like putting a frame around something that did not fit inside frames. They created a new designation, one that had no direct translation in most Union languages, because most Union languages had never needed a word for this particular concept. The closest English equivalent, when the translators finally settled on something, was not a rank, or a title, or a threat level. It was a description. The ones who walk through. And across the galaxy, species that had spent 6 months laughing nervously at humanity's eating habits stopped laughing, because the species that ate poison for breakfast had just walked through a cloud of death to save strangers, and complained about the smell on the way out. Tal Morrow had been given a room on the 42nd floor of the Union Cultural Archive. A desk made of a material he could not identify, a chair designed for a species with 3 legs, and a task that would have made any reasonable xenoanthropologist pour a very large drink. He was supposed to explain humanity, all of it, 10,000 years of civilization compressed into a cultural submission for the archive, formatted according to Union Standard Template 7 Gamma, which required sections on biology, social organization, spiritual practices, technological development, and, this was the part that made Tao want to scream into his hands, a section labeled Species Disposition, Threat or Collaborative. The Union wanted to know what humanity was, not biologically. They had Vyeth's reports for that, all 4,200 pages of chemical horror and baffled footnotes. not militarily. Humanity's weapon systems have been catalogued, noted as primitive but enthusiastic, filed. What the Union wanted, what 31 species and their governments and their citizens and their children, who were now afraid of the funny-looking bipeds from the third planet of an unremarkable star, was an answer to a much simpler and much harder question. Why? Why did humanity eat poison? Why did humanity survive things that killed everything else? Why did 4 humans walk into a gas that could melt bone and come out the other side carrying strangers? The Union had theories. They always had theories. The most popular one, circulating through academic networks and diplomatic backchannels and late-night xenobiology forums, was that humanity had been engineered. That some ancient species long extinct had built humans as biological weapons, shock troops, designed to operate in environments too toxic for conventional life. It was a clean theory, logical. It fit the data if you squinted hard enough. Wrong. Tal knew this, because Tal had spent 6 months buried in the most chaotic, contradictory, beautiful, horrifying, cultural archive any species had ever produced, and the answer was not clean or logical or anything that fit neatly into Union Standard Template 7 Gamma. The answer was that humanity was hungry, and stubborn, and too stupid, in the most magnificent possible way, to stop eating things that hurt them. He stood before the Union Assembly on a Tuesday, which was appropriate, given that Taco Tuesday had become a phrase that now appeared in 17 species threat assessment databases. The assembly chamber was vast, a tiered hemisphere of floating platforms and atmospheric pods, and every seat was full, because the human was going to explain the human, and nobody wanted to miss it. "You want to know why we are the way we are?" Tal said, and his voice was steady in a way that surprised him, because his hands were absolutely not. Program. A design. A moment in our history when someone decided to make us resistant to everything your biology considers lethal. He let the pause do its work. There is no program. There is no design. There is just a very long story about a species that could not leave anything alone. He pulled up the first image on the holographic display, a chili pepper, bright red, small, curved like a question mark, and as far as 31 species were concerned, a tiny grenade made of pain. 60,000 years ago, Tal said, a human ate one of these for the first time. We do not know who, we do not know where exactly, but we know what happened, because it is the same thing that happens every time a human eats a chili pepper for the first time. They burned, their mouth filled with fire, their eyes watered, their bodies screamed at them, through every nerve it had available, that this was a mistake, that this bright little fruit was not food, that they should spit it out and never touch it again. And then, Tal said, they ate another one. The assembly was very quiet. That is the entire story of humanity, Tal said. That is the answer to your question. We did not build resistance to poison. We did not evolve in a weapons lab. We just kept eating things that hurt us, and when they did not kill us, we went back for seconds. He moved through the evidence with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this in the shower 14 times. Ethanol. Somewhere in the deep past, a human had eaten fermented fruit that had gone wrong. The ethanol in it disrupted their motor function, impaired their judgment, made them dizzy and sick, and instead of marking it as toxic and moving on, which is what every other species in the galaxy had done when they encountered ethanol, that human had thought, how do I make more of this, and how do I make it stronger? Humanity had spent the next 10,000 years perfecting the art of deliberate fermentation. Wine from grapes, beer from grain, whiskey from barley, distilled and aged and treated with the reverence other species reserved for sacred relics. They built entire cultures around the consumption of a compound that was, in Union terms, an industrial solvent. You use ethanol to clean engine parts, Tal said. We use it to celebrate weddings. Caffeine. A plant had evolved to produce a compound specifically designed to kill anything that tried to eat it. Insects that consumed caffeine died. Small mammals that consumed caffeine died. Humans who consumed caffeine experienced elevated heart rate, enhanced focus, mild euphoria, and a strong opinion about whether the barista had gotten their order right. You classified caffeine as a neurotoxin, Tal said. We classified it as a morning requirement. Capsaicin, cheese, fermented fish, raw garlic, mustard so strong it made human eyes water, and human sinuses burn, and human ancestors reach for more, because the pain was not just pain. It was flavor. It was sensation. It was the body being alive in a way that bland, safe, neutral food could never achieve. Here's what I need you to understand, Tal said, and he could feel the room tilting toward him, not physically, but attentionally, the way a crowd leans when it senses the important part coming. We did not do this because we were tough. We did not do this because we were brave. We did it because we are, at our core, a species that cannot resist finding out what happens next. The first human who ate a pepper did not know it would not kill them. They ate it anyway. The first human who drank fermented grain did not know they would survive the night. They drank it anyway. The first human who looked at mold growing on curdled milk and thought, "I wonder what that tastes like," was not conducting a scientific experiment. They were being human, which means being curious and being reckless and being absolutely, catastrophically unwilling to leave anything on the plate untried. He took a breath. Your theory is that we were engineered, that some ancient species designed us to be weapons. And I understand why you think that, because when you look at our biology, it does not make sense. No rational species should be able to drink industrial solvent at celebrations, and walk through chemical clouds that dissolve your bones, and eat peppers that exist solely to cause pain. But you are making an error. You are looking for a grand design, when the truth is so much simpler and so much stranger. We were not designed. We were just hungry. And everything on our planet was trying to kill us. And instead of avoiding the things that burned and stung and poisoned and fermented, we put them in a pot and added salt and called it dinner. He paused one final time. We did not evolve to survive poison, he said. We evolved to season with it. The assembly sat in a silence that lasted long enough for Tal to wonder if he had broken something. Then the Keth elder in the front row, the same Ambassador Kithari, who 1 year ago had declared humanity an engineered weapon, made a sound that Tal's translator could not initially parse. It cycled through 7 languages before settling, uncertainly, on laughter. The elder was laughing. A species of cooks, Kithari said, and the translator caught the warmth in it this time, the shift from suspicion to something that might have been the beginning of respect. The galaxy has been frightened of a species of cooks. The best cooks are always a little frightening, Tal said. The cultural submission was accepted into the archive the following day. It was filed not under threat assessment or biological anomaly, but under a new category that the archivists created specifically for humanity. Adaptive consumption species. Variable, disposition curious. Recommended approach, accept any dinner invitation. And 3 days after Tal's presentation, a formal diplomatic request arrived from the Keth Dominion. Not for a military alliance, not for a hazmat contract, not for any of the things the galaxy had been trying to reduce humanity to for the past year. They wanted a chef. Specifically, they wanted to understand what kind of species looked at an entire planet full of things trying to kill it. Every fruit armored in acid, every plant loaded with toxin, every fermentation a small act of biological warfare, and said with absolute sincerity, "This needs garlic." The kitchen that Amadou Diallo built on Calith Station did not look like a kitchen. It looked like a chemistry lab, designed by someone who had strong feelings about butter. 12 preparation stations, each one calibrated to the atmospheric requirements of a different species. each one equipped with gas chromatographs and spectral analyzers, and a handwritten note taped to the counter in Amadou's cramped handwriting that said, "Taste everything before it leaves this station, or I will end you." Amadou had arrived on Kayla 3 weeks earlier, stepping off the transport shuttle in a chef's coat that had seen more combat than most military uniforms, carrying 2 suitcases. One held his clothes, the other held his knives, 47 of them, each one wrapped in cloth like a sleeping child. He had run a 3 Michelin star restaurant in Lyon for 9 years. He had cooked for presidents and criminals, and once, on a very strange Tuesday, for a table of 11 nuns, had ordered the tasting menu with wine pairings and stayed until 2 in the morning. He had left all of it behind and volunteered for the diplomatic corps because, as he told the recruiter, with the calm certainty of a man stating a physical law, cooking for humans got boring. I want to cook for someone who has never tasted anything. Now he stood in his impossible kitchen on an alien space station, running his fingers along a row of spices that had traveled 4 light-years in a temperature-controlled case, and the look on his face was the one Riva had seen on the faces of artists and surgeons and bomb disposal technicians. The look of someone about to do the thing they were made for. The dinner was Riva's idea, or rather, Riva's assignment. The Union Council had approved the first interspecies diplomatic meal, and they had asked her to host it, because she was the human who had explained cheese to an auditorium and carried a child through a poison cloud and somehow remained the person the galaxy found least terrifying. "We need to show them who we are," Reva had told Amadou during their first planning session. "Not the biology, not the resistance, not the walking through death part. The real thing underneath all of it. Why we eat what we eat, why food matters to us, in ways it does not seem to matter to anyone else in this galaxy." Amadou had listened to this with his arms crossed and his eyes half closed, which Reva had learned was not boredom, but his processing face. "You want me to make aliens cry," he said. "I want you to make aliens understand." "Same thing," he said. The challenge was not small. 12 species at the table, 12 radically different biologies. The Telvanni were photosynthetic, silicon-boned, and had never consumed anything through an oral cavity. The Drovari metabolized through dermal absorption. The Keth had not eaten in the traditional sense for 400 years. One of them would be killed, in various creative ways, by the compounds that made human food human. Amadou's solution was not to remove those compounds, it was to whisper them. A scream and a whisper used the same voice, he told Tal, who had been brought on as cultural consultant, and was currently sitting on a supply crate eating crackers and taking notes. "The difference is volume. I am not going to lie to them. I am not going to serve them safe, empty, nothing food and call it human. I am going to give them the truth of what we eat, just quiet enough that it will not kill them." He spent 2 weeks building the menu. Capsaicin at 0.001% concentration, a fraction of what a human would taste. But for a Telvanni, whose silicon-based biology had never once in evolutionary history encountered the compound, it would register as warmth. Not heat, not pain, warmth. The kind of warmth that humans felt when they held a cup of tea, or stood in a patch of sunlight, or pressed their hand against someone else's hand. Vyeth would feel warmth for the first time in her life. Ethanol vapor, suspended over a dessert of crystallized nectar. Not enough to intoxicate, not enough to impair, but enough for a Drovhari to feel the faintest loosening, the barest softening of the rigid self-control that their species wore like armor. What humans called loosening up. What humans knew as the moment at a dinner party when the conversation stopped being polite and started being real. And the broth was Amadou's masterpiece. He built it over 9 days, layer upon layer of umami, extracted from mushrooms and seaweed and fermented soybean and slow-roasted bones, each element added at a concentration calibrated to the Keth palate, which had not tasted anything in 4 centuries, because the Keth had evolved past the need for chemical consumption and considered it a primitive function of lesser species. They think they are above food, Amadou said, stirring the broth at 3 in the morning with the focus of a man defusing a bomb. They are wrong. Nothing is above food. Food is the first language. Before words, before music, before mathematics, a living thing put something in its mouth and understood the world through flavor. The Keth have forgotten that. I am going to remind them. A night of the dinner, Kaleth Station's diplomatic hall had been transformed. A single long table, human style, because Reva had insisted. Not floating platforms, not atmospheric pods, not species-segregated sections. One table, every species side by side, because that was how humans did it. You sat next to the person who was different from you, and you passed them the bread, and you figured it out. 12 delegations arrived, 38 individuals. Some walked, some floated, some were carried in atmospheric enclosures. The Telvanni delegate was Vyeth, who had requested the seat herself, because she had spent a year studying the species that terrified her. And she was done being afraid. Riva stood at the head of the table and did not give a speech. Speeches were for species that needed words to say what they meant. Tonight, the food would talk. The first course arrived, a clear soup, deceptively simple, served in bowls designed by Amadou for each species' method of consumption. The Telvanni bowls were shallow, designed for dermal contact. The Drovari portions were vaporized for membrane absorption. The Queth servings were aerosolized, delivered through atmospheric diffusion. Vyeth touched the surface of her bowl. The warmth hit her first. She had studied warmth. She had read about it. She had measured it in human bodies and understood it as a metabolic byproduct, a thermal signature, a biological function. She had never felt it. It bloomed across her silicon fingertips like a small sunrise. Not hot, not burning, just warm. The way Riva's hand had been warm when she had shaken it 1 year ago, and Vyeth had flinched because she did not know what the sensation meant. Now she knew. It meant someone had made something and put care into it and offered it to her, and the warmth was not a temperature. It was an intention. Down the table, the Dravhari ambassador inhaled the ethanol vapor and made a sound that his translator rendered as "oh." Just "oh." But the "oh" carried the weight of someone who had spent their entire life holding themselves at a careful distance from every experience, and had just felt, for one brief and terrifying moment, what it was like to let go. And at the far end of the table, Keth Elder Kethari, 400 years old, photosynthetic, post-consumption, above the crude biological need for flavor, leaned over the aerosolized broth and breathed in. The umami hit the elder's chemoreceptors like a memory of something that had never happened. Richness, a depth, a complexity that the Keth language did not have words for, because the Keth had not needed those words in 400 years. Kethari wept. Not the dramatic weeping of grief or pain, the quiet weeping of recognition, the tears of a being who had just discovered that they had been missing something they did not know existed, and the missing of it was vast, and the finding of it was like walking into a room in their own home that they had somehow never opened. Nobody spoke. Amadou stood in the kitchen doorway and watched through the glass, and did not smile, because smiling would have diminished it. He just watched, the way a gardener watches rain fall on seeds they planted months ago. The dinner lasted 4 hours. Each course was a conversation. Each flavor was an argument. The argument was not that humans were strong, or brave, or resistant, or dangerous. The argument was simpler and older and truer than any of those things. Here. We made this. We want you to taste it. That is what food means. That is what it has always meant. At the end of the meal, when the last course had been cleared, and the table was scattered with the evidence of 12 species learning to share a meal for the first time in galactic history, Vyeth reached for the small dish that had been placed at every setting as a final offering. A single grain of rice, seasoned with black pepper. Black pepper, piperine, a compound that in concentrated form would trigger respiratory failure in a Telvanni within minutes. Here, at this concentration, it was a whisper, a ghost of heat, a suggestion. Vyeth placed the grain on the tip of her tongue. The heat was infinitesimal, a murmur, a rumor of the fire that humans chased every day of their lives. It sat on her silicate tongue like a question asked very quietly in a language she was only beginning to learn. She reached for another grain. Table. Reva watched. She watched an alien learn what every human already knew. That the best things in the universe, the ones worth crossing stars for, worth building kitchens on space stations for, worth sitting at a table with strangers for, always burned a little on the way down. And that the burning was not the price, it was the point.